meant when they thought that a particular human was a god, or that a god had become a human. This claim was not unique to Christians. Even though Jesus may be the only miracle-working Son of God that we know about in our world, numerous people in antiquity, among both pagans and Jews, were thought to have been both human and divine. It is important already at this stage to stress a fundamental historical point about how we might imagine the divine realm. By divine realm, I mean that world that is inhabited by superhuman divine beings, God, or the gods, or other superhuman forces. For most people today, divinity is a black and white issue. A being is either God or not God. God is up there in the heavenly realm, and we are down here in this realm. And there is an unbridgeable chasm between these two realms. With this kind of assumption firmly entrenched in our thinking, it is very hard to imagine how a person could be both God and human at once. Moreover, when put in these black and white terms, it is relatively easy to say, as I used to say before doing the research for this book, that the early Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in which Jesus never makes explicit divine claims about himself, portray Jesus as a human but not as God, whereas the Gospel of John, in which Jesus does make such divine claims, does indeed portray him as God. Yet other scholars forcefully disagree with this view and argue that Jesus is portrayed as God even in these earlier Gospels. As a result, there are many debates over what scholars have called a high Christology, in which Jesus is thought of as a divine being. This is called high because Christ originates up there with God. The term Christology literally means understanding of Christ. And what they have called a low Christology, in which Jesus is thought of as a human being, low because he originates down here, with us. Given this perspective, in which way is Jesus portrayed in the Gospels? As God or as human? What I have come to see is that scholars have such disagreements in part because they typically answer the question of high or low Christology on the basis of the paradigm I have just described, that the divine and human realms are categorically distinct, with a great chasm separating the two. The problem is that most ancient people, whether Christian, Jewish, or pagan, did not have this paradigm. For them, the human realm was not an absolute category separated from the divine realm by an enormous and unbridgeable crevasse. On the contrary, the human and divine were two continuums that could and did overlap. In the ancient world, it was possible to believe in a number of ways that a human was divine. Here are two major ways it could happen, as attested in Christian, Jewish, and pagan sources. I will be discussing other ways in the course of the book. By adoption or exaltation. A human being, say a great ruler or warrior or holy person, could be made divine by an act of God or a god, by being elevated to a level of divinity that she or he did not previously have. By nature or incarnation. A divine being, say an angel or one of the gods, could become human, either permanently or more commonly temporarily. One of my theses will be that a Christian text such as the Gospel of Mark understands Jesus in the first way, as a human who came to be made divine. The Gospel of John understands him in the second way, as a divine being who became human. Both of them see Jesus as divine, but in different ways. Thus, before discussing the different early Christian views of what it meant to call Jesus God, I set the stage by considering how ancient people understood the intersecting realms of the divine and the human. In Chapter 1, I discussed the views that were widely held in the Greek and Roman worlds outside both Judaism and Christianity. There we will see that indeed a kind of continuum within the divine realm allowed some overlap between divine beings and humans, a matter of no surprise for readers familiar with ancient mythologies in which the gods became, temporarily, human, and humans became, permanently, gods. Somewhat more surprising may be the discussion of Chapter 2, in which I show that analogous understandings existed even within the world of ancient Judaism. This will be of particular importance since Jesus and his earliest followers were thoroughly Jewish in every way, and as it turns out, many ancient Jews too believed not only that divine beings, such as angels, could become human, but that human beings could become divine. Some humans were actually called God. This is true not only in documents from outside the Bible, but also, even more surprising, in documents within it. After I've established the views of both pagans and Jews, we can move in Chapter 3 to consider the life of the historical Jesus. Here my focus is on the question of whether Jesus talked about himself as God. It is a difficult question to answer, in no small measure because of the sources of information at our disposal for knowing anything at all about the life and teachings of Jesus. And so I begin the chapter by discussing the problems that our surviving sources, especially the Gospels of the New Testament, pose for us when we want to know historically what happened during Jesus' ministry. Among other things, I show why the majority of critical scholars for more than a century have argued that Jesus is best understood as an apocalyptic prophet